This was a global conflict, and the fighting extended far beyond the western and eastern fronts. As a stalemate took hold in Europe, British commanders sought to launch a new offensive on a different front. But where should it be? The Baltic or the Mediterranean? In early August 1914, two German warships, the Breslau and the Goeben, were being chased by 16 British vessels in the Mediterranean. In a bid to escape capture, the ships sped toward the Turkish coast, where they were handed over to neutral Turkey and incorporated into the Turkish Navy. Enver Pasha, the Turkish Minister of War and Commander-in-Chief, had been trained in German military schools and played a key role in modernizing the Turkish army along German lines. Enver Pasha permitted the Breslau and the Goeben to enter the Black Sea, where they wreaked havoc by shelling Russian ports. By the 31st of October 1914, Turkey was officially at war with the Allied powers. As Allied commanders surveyed the map, the Dardanelles appeared to be a promising prospect. Capturing the peninsula would allow grain to flow from Russia and munitions to enter, while also encouraging the remaining Balkan nations to join the Allied cause. Moreover, it would serve as a strong defense for the Suez Canal in Egypt to the south. Churchill exclaimed,
"The greatest satisfaction was expressed at the Admiralty, and I found myself in these days surrounded by smiling faces."
Unexpected events began to unfold. Abandoned Turkish forts were suddenly manned again, now equipped with new guns and additional soldiers. Minefields appeared in the channel, and the tugs assigned to clear them were driven off by gunfire from the shore. Opinions started to shift, casting doubt on whether the Navy alone could accomplish the task. Lord Fisher, First Sea Lord, remarked,
"The Dardanelles, futile without soldiers. Someone will have to land at Gallipoli some time or other."
But where would the soldiers come from? In Egypt, Australians, New Zealanders, Indians, and troops from across the empire were gathered, but they were poorly equipped and undertrained. A regular division had to be freed from the Western Front for the operation. Reluctantly, Lord Kitchener agreed to send the 29th Division to join the campaign in the Turkish Straits. The French also offered a division. In total, 70,000 men were prepared to invade the Gallipoli Peninsula. To lead the offensive, Kitchener appointed his friend, Sir Ian Hamilton. Kitchener told him,
"We are sending a military force to support the fleet now at the Dardanelles, and you are to have command. If the fleet gets through, Constantinople will fall of itself, and you will have won not a battle, but the war."
On 18th March, Hamilton watched as the fleet delivered its final blow to the shores of the Turkish Straits. They shelled relentlessly until suddenly the French ship Beauvais exploded and sank within minutes, taking 700 men with it. By the end of the day, 3 Allied ships lay at the bottom of the straits, and 3 more were severely damaged by mines or gunfire. The fleet was ordered to retire. Constantinople was thrown into a state of panic, with the city preparing for evacuation. However, as the days passed and the Allies failed to appear, a new sense of confidence began to take hold among the Turkish commanders. Pasha Enver, in particular, was filled with optimism.
"I shall go down in history as the man who demonstrated the vulnerability of the British fleet."
The new Turkish confidence turned inward, and the Christian Armenians, tribal people whose homeland was split between Russian and Turkish hands, were massacred, with over 750,000 killed. Their crime? Being suspected traitors to the Turkish war effort. The Pomeranian Otto Lehmann von Sanders was given command of 6 Turkish divisions to defend the Gallipoli Peninsula. Under his leadership, the Turkish army built defences atop the hills along the straits, waiting for the Allies. But they didn't come. Supply chain issues in Egypt complicated the preparation of troops. Hamilton decided on a 6-pronged attack, including 2 feigned offensives to confuse Sanders' Turkish forces. The French would land on the Adriatic coast before withdrawing, and further north at Bola, the British Navy would stage a mock offensive. At 4 a.m. on the 25th of April, the Anzacs were determined to make a name for their young nations.
It was pitch dark. Then all of a sudden, a dim outline of the coast loomed up. As we got closer, we were all getting tensed up now and nervous, wondering what was going to happen as everything was so quiet. Then a single shot rang out and a yellowish light flared up in the sky. From then, everything was let loose. Machine gun and rifle fire directed at the boats. The pinnaces cast us off. The muddled oarsmen took up the row. We were rowed ashore. As soon as the boats grounded, it was every man for himself. It was out. As we scrambled ashore, those who were lucky enough to get there, we found what cover under the cliff we could. As we lay there for a few moments, gathering our wind, we slipped off our pack, fixed our bayonets, and someone in the crowd, there was no officer, no one in charge. The order was, right lads, after the bastards.
Von Sanders was awakened at 5 a.m. by urgent reports that the Allies had arrived. He rushed to Bulla to prepare for their arrival, but they never came. The feigned attacks had worked. The French had landed on the Adriatic coast, capturing 500 prisoners as they withdrew. At S Beach, or Motor Bay, the landing was a success, much like at Y Beach, where over 2,000 men landed without casualties. However, they did not press further inland toward Krithia. At the southernmost point, Hellas Point, where the landing group for V Beach was set to land, the situation was much more perilous. In broad daylight, the SS River Clyde was beached, ramps were lowered, and several boats filled with troops began their journey to the shore. The Turks were waiting.
Well, they opened up on the shore. And there was firing. Not only machine guns, rifle fire, they had these nice little pom-pom shells, all nice painted colours, beautiful things. And they was hitting off at the side of the ship and ripping the people to pieces. And even the bullets, if they missed you, was hitting the ship and echoing, tearing pieces out of them.
The Allied troops were forced to take cover behind the River Clyde and wait until nightfall. The beach was finally secured the next day, but only after intense and bitter fighting. With beachheads established, the Allied forces assessed their gains. The most secure footholds were at Hellas Point and Gabatepe. Gabatepe was later renamed Anzac Cove, in honour of the Australia and New Zealand Corps that fought so valiantly there under the command of Sir William Birdwood. Hamilton issued orders for an advance to reach the original objectives, which had been left unfulfilled after the landings. The Anzacs pushed the Turkish forces to their limits and were on the verge of a major breakthrough when a young general named Mustafa Kemal rallied his troops to defend their homeland.
I don't order you to attack. I order you to die.
The Turks rallied and drove the Anzacs back across their beachhead. The Anzacs dug in and braced themselves for the Turkish counter-offensive, which came in waves. From 28th April to 4th June, 3 fierce battles unfolded around Cynthia.
They came over in 2 great waves from their trenches, in great hulking mass, which they were rather big men, the Turks, fine body of men. As they came over in 2 great waves, they were shouting "Allo" and blowing their trumpets and whistling and shouting like schoolboys. As they got closer, within nice rifle range, we had the order to fire. We opened fire with rapid fire and brought them down in hundreds. Hundreds of them fell. And in front of our trench, I should think, when the attack was over, there would be anything to do to 3,000 dead and dying in front of our brigade. They were lying there, and for about 3 or 4 days, they smelled it so awful. We prayed that the wind would blow in from the sea and take the stench of the dead over into the Turkish trenches instead of blowing it to our own, as the stench got so awful at that time.
Bodies piled upon bodies in the Mediterranean summer heat, the stench unbearable. A frontline armistice was called so that the dead could be buried. Turkish and Allied troops crawled out of their trenches to bury their fallen comrades in common graves, with no distinctions made between them. The summer dragged on. The Allied camps shifted between two extremes, moments of boredom and the constant presence of death. Men carved out makeshift homes in the hillsides where they would cook or play cards. Bathing in the sea offered a brief respite from the scorching heat and a chance to wash off the grime. Water was scarce, and so there was always someone running through the camp, distributing water to the parched soldiers. Yet, the darker side of camp life was the ever-present smell of death. Men left to rot in the no-man's land.
During the day, we could see the vultures heading down toward the bodies of both Turks and our own men. And occasionally we would take a pot shot at them to try and keep them off, particularly if we thought there was somebody wounded out in front. But we couldn't fire too much at them for fear of giving away our own position, because the Turks seemed to have very good observation posts and were able to see practically everything that we did.
Water was very scarce, and when the summer came, of course it brought the disease and the flies with it. The rations, of course, was nothing only bully beef and apricot jam. And when we did get the summer, the jam was a regular issue, nothing else but apricot. When you opened that, it was almost like water. You couldn't put it on your biscuit or anything like that. It was just a matter of pouring it on. And before you could get that to your mouth, it was absolutely, well, literally covered with flies. Holding it with dropping the tin and holding one biscuit with one hand and waving the flies off with the other all the time.
If the soldiers were not struck by Turkish bullets, disease was there to hinder them. During the summer months of the campaign, more than 1,000 men per week were pulled from the front lines due to dysentery. Despite the sacrifices made by the Allied soldiers, the Turkish forces held the heights of the region, always watching and looking down on the invaders. Back in Britain, Admiral Fisher, a long-time critic of Churchill's Dardanelles campaign, resigned in protest. Fisher believed the campaign was a waste of Britain's Grand Fleet. A few weeks later, the Liberal-led government was ousted, and calls for Churchill's resignation grew louder. The army was becoming bogged down, and it seemed unlikely they would be able to break through. Yet, on the battlefield, a certain respect began to develop between the Anzacs, the Allied soldiers, and the Turkish forces.
The Turkish soldier was very highly regarded by me and all the men on our side. He was always a clean fighter and one of the most courageous men in the world. When they came, there was no beating about it, but they faced up to the heaviest rifle fire that you could put up, and nothing would stop them. They were almost fanatical. We came to the conclusion that he was a very good bloke indeed. We had a lot of time for him.
On the other side of the trenches, the Turkish soldiers were impressed by the resourcefulness of the Allied forces, how they crafted bombs from jam tins and managed to create homes and harbours in such inhospitable terrain. After German U-boats sneaked into the harbour and sank 2 British battleships, the fleet was ordered to withdraw, slipping beneath the summer sunset. Most of the faith in the campaign faded, but not before one final attack was launched. On 6th August, a bold landing was made at Suvla Bay, situated in front of a parched salt lake. The landing was initially successful, but the weaknesses of the newly mustered troops quickly became apparent as they failed to push further inland. To the right of the landing, the Australians faced some of their fiercest fighting at Lone Pine. Originally intended as a diversion to cover the new landings and Allied movements across Saros Bay, Lone Pine became infamous for the Anzac troops. The Australians' goal was to seize the Turkish trenches above Anzac Cove. However, once they reached the hill, they found the Turkish trenches were heavily fortified with earth and logs, preventing them from entering. From this position, the Turkish troops fired at the Australians from point-blank range, causing heavy casualties. The Turkish army launched several waves of reinforcements to recapture the trenches, but ultimately, they failed. With over 10,000 casualties between the Turkish and Australian forces, it became one of the bloodiest engagements of the entire campaign. However, the primary objective of the operation was not achieved. The new landing force was stalled and no significant progress was made. Hamilton began to lose faith in the operation. On 16th October, he was recalled to London, and his replacement, Sir Charles Munro, visited the landing sites and concluded that a breakthrough was impossible.
He came, he saw, he capitulated.
Churchill lamented,
Well, I've seen the place. It's an awful place, and you'll never get through.
the most successful operation of the entire Gallipoli campaign was, in fact, the evacuation. For it to succeed, the Turkish army had to remain unaware that the Allies were retreating. Elaborate ruses were put in place on the beach to keep things appearing as normal as possible. Men swam in the water, supply boxes were moved from place to place, and rifle mechanisms were rigged to make the front lines seem active. In December, the Anzacs managed to escape, and by January, Helles was evacuated. As the last munitions were destroyed by naval gunfire, the men who had endured the campaign finally saw the bizarre nightmare of Gallipoli come to an end. On the night of the 31st of May, 42 German warships left their North Sea anchorage to attack Allied shipping off the Norwegian coast. They also hoped to encounter the British Grand Fleet with their 24 battleships, 5 battle cruisers, 11 light cruisers, and 63 destroyers, hoping that a victory would break the ever-tightening British blockade. By 2 p.m. on the 1st of June, a British naval force consisting of 28 battleships, 9 battle cruisers, 34 light cruisers, and 80 destroyers was bearing down on the German fleet. Two formidable forces were about to collide, bringing into sharp focus the training, experience, abilities, and ambitions of 4 legendary admirals. Hipper and Scheer on the German side, and Jellicoe and Beatty on the British. The first engagement began just before 4 p.m. when Hipper and Beatty's ships came into sight of each other. During the action, the British battlecruiser Indefatigable was sunk and 1,017 men drowned. Soon after, the Queen Mary was blown out of the water, taking 1,266 men with her. At 6 p.m., off the coast of Jutland, a second engagement ensued, with Hipper and Jellicoe in direct contention, as 96 British ships stood between 59 German ships and their escape route. Hipper's flagship, the battlecruiser Lützow, was disabled by 24 direct hits. Despite her heavy damage, Lützow, guns still firing, managed to sink the British battlecruiser Invincible, taking all but 6 of her crewmen with her. Shortly afterward, Lützow followed her foe to a watery grave, with 994 German sailors going down with her. Beatty's flagship, the Lion, was also damaged and taking water. Then, just after 6:30, Scheer executed a previously rehearsed withdrawal back to base, losing only a single outdated battleship, the Pommern. For the Germans, despite suffering fewer losses than the British, the Battle of Jutland was still a significant setback. Afterward, they decided not to risk another major naval engagement, Britain lost 3 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 8 destroyers. The Germans lost 1 battleship, 4 cruisers, and 5 destroyers. The Kaiser famously boasted that the spell of Trafalgar was broken, yet the German fleet never again sought battle with the Grand Fleet. Scheer reported to the Kaiser, acknowledging that victory could only be achieved through a submarine campaign targeting British trade. The outcome of Jutland was also a blow for Britain, which had hoped that in any major naval confrontation, its numerical superiority would decisively break the power of the German fleet. A somewhat grim Admiralty communiqué was followed by a second, more optimistic one, drafted by Winston Churchill at the request of the British government, attempting to cast the battle in a more positive light. Yet, the one undeniable fact was the loss of hundreds of young men, many barely out of their teens, who perished in cold, anonymous graves, unaware of the broader issues at stake. On the British warships alone, 6,097 sailors drowned. On the German ships, 2,551 sailors had been lost. Then, on the 5th of June, Britain suffered another devastating loss at sea. In the cold waters of the North Sea, the British cruiser Hampshire, on its way to Russia, was sunk by a German mine northwest of Scapa Flow. Aboard was the Secretary of State for War, Lord Kitchener, the man who had rebuilt the British Army in 1914. He was on a special mission to Russia. As the ship sank, Kitchener disappeared beneath the waves. While his cabinet colleagues had long considered him ineffective to the public, he was seen as the figure who had given strength and stability to the nation's war effort. By 1916, the Russian army had been severely weakened. German Chief of the General Staff, Falkenhayn, believed it unlikely that the Russians would launch a new offensive anytime soon. As a result, troops were transferred to the Western Front for a fresh attack against the French. In February of 1916, as the Battle of Verdun began in the west, the French called for assistance. Along the Southern Front, the Italians pleaded for relief against the Austrians. In response, Tsar Nicholas was asked to initiate another offensive to tie down the German and Austrian forces. To lead this difficult new attack, the Tsar chose General Alexei Brusilov. Brusilov had earned a reputation as one of the few Russian commanders to achieve consistent victories against the Central Powers. As the leader of the Russian Eighth Army, he recognized the importance of heavy artillery and meticulous planning when organizing an assault. By coordinating aerial support to synchronize precise artillery bombardments and positioning machine gun nests throughout his trenches, Brusilov managed to achieve victories where others had faced devastating losses. His attack was planned to align with Russian forces in the north, along the East Prussian border. The goal was to strike both the Austrians and Germans simultaneously, hoping to divide the Central Powers' defensive efforts and create confusion in their ranks. Ludendorff had been advocating for the German High Command to consolidate control of the Eastern Front under Hindenburg, but his requests were ignored. The Austrians, unwilling to publicly acknowledge German dominance, insisted on maintaining independent command of their forces. As a result, the army facing Brusilov was under the command of Archduke Friedrich of Austria. On June 4th, Brusilov's artillery unleashed a thunderous barrage in the southwest, and the Russian 3rd, 8th, 11th, 7th, and 9th armies launched their assault on the Austrian lines. The Battle of Loos had begun. Brusilov's forces caught the Austrians off guard. Having sent a significant portion of their troops southwest to confront the Italians in the Trentino, the divisions left to defend the east were few in number and largely composed of southern Slavic soldiers. In the first few days, the Russians captured over 9,700 square miles of territory and destroyed the Austrian 4th and 7th armies. The Austrians suffered devastating losses, with more than 1.5 million men lost, including 400,000 taken prisoner. Initially, Brusilov's offensive was intended as a distraction, with the main thrust of the attack planned for the north, where the Russian Western Army, under Ebets, was supposed to strike. However, the anticipated northern assault never materialized. As Brusilov's losses mounted and his advance into Volhynia lost momentum, the offensive gradually lost its force. Without support from the north, Brusilov was eventually forced to pull back his advancing troops as German reinforcements strengthened the Austrian lines. Although Brusilov came close to knocking the Austrians out of the war, the eventual stabilization of the front lines left the Russian army demoralized. As shortages worsened due to the faltering war effort, an increasing number of peasants fled the countryside in search of refuge. Many gathered in Moscow and the capital, Petrograd. Some found work in the war factories, but far more became vagrants, aimlessly wandering the streets hungry and desperate. The Duma, Russia's elected body, pressed the Tsar to grant more power to elected officials, hoping they could better manage the war effort and bring relief to those suffering on the home front. Yet, Tsar Nicholas II, ever the autocrat, remained steadfast in his control. On the day of his coronation, he had vowed,
"I shall maintain the principle of autocracy just as firmly and unflinchingly as it was preserved by my dead father."
The Tsar spent the majority of his time with his hemophiliac son, Tsarevich Alexei, and his cherished army. In 1915, he took on the role of supreme commander of all Russian forces. But defeat after crushing defeat sapped the army's will to continue fighting. By the winter of 1916-17, the morale of the Russian soldiers had shattered. Desertions, once unthinkable, were now in the hundreds of thousands. Those who remained on the front lines were increasingly abandoning their trenches, meeting their German counterparts face to face, often in quiet fraternization. At home, conditions were deteriorating rapidly, as Russia's traditional system of autocracy and orthodoxy could no longer suppress the growing tide of revolutionary sentiment. Peasant life in the early 20th century was dire, with most living in cramped, dirt-floored huts, alongside their livestock. The situation worsened as more peasants fled from the lands overrun by the German advance, clogging the roads in search of refuge. Strikes in the cities became increasingly frequent with each passing month. While the Tsar led his armies to the front, his wife, Tsarina Alexandra, was left to manage affairs on the home front. The German-born, English-educated niece of Queen Victoria had become deeply influenced by the mysterious Siberian wanderer Grigory Rasputin, whose influence over her would soon become legendary. Rasputin was a scandalous figure, notorious for his debauchery, yet his ability to soothe the Tsarevich during hemophiliac crises made him an indispensable part of the royal court. His wild, drunken orgies, held in full view of Russian high society, severely tarnished the monarchy's reputation both at home and abroad. On December 30th, 1916, Felix Yusupov, Vladimir Purishkevich, and Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich Romanov lured Rasputin to Yusupov's palace in Petrograd. The three conspirators poisoned him with cyanide-laced cakes, stabbed him, and shot him as he tried to flee over the palace walls. The cause of death was later determined to be drowning in the Neva River. Their actions were widely celebrated across the empire, seen as a necessary act to rid Russia of the man who had gained so much influence over the royal family. The winter of 1916-17 was particularly harsh. Widespread shortages of food and fuel left the population hungry, cold, and desperate. On February 23, 1917, protests erupted in the streets of Petrograd. Initially sparked by International Women's Day, the demonstrations quickly evolved into calls for a change in government. Over the next 2 days, the crowds swelled, and the atmosphere became increasingly volatile. Nicholas ordered that force be used to suppress the unrest. On February 26th and 27th, the Pavlovsky Regiment, tasked with firing on the protesters, held an all-night meeting where they voted to defy orders and refuse to shoot at civilians. Mikhail Rodzianko, the leader of the loyal opposition in the Duma, urgently sent a telegram to the Tsar at the front. warning that the mob had taken control of the streets. The Tsar's reply came swiftly.
This fat Rodzianko has sent me some nonsense to which I will not even reply.
By the 27th of February, most of Petrograd had fallen into the hands of the mob, which now demanded that the Duma take control. After receiving the Tsar's suggestion to place the throne in the hands of his brother Michael, members of the Duma met with Michael Romanov to persuade him not to accept the crown. The city and the government were transferred to the elected Duma, with a Soviet or council also convening in the same building. The Soviet issued Order No. 1, which encouraged soldiers to reject the authority of their officers and elect representatives for a soldiers' Soviet. This order created a deep divide within the army. Both the Duma and the Soviets were now responsible for overseeing Russia's continued war effort. Continuing the war was viewed as a way of defending democratic revolutionary gains. On June 18th, Alexander Kerensky, Minister of War and later leader of the provisional government, called for a new offensive, to be led by the new Commander-in-Chief, Alexei Brusilov. Kerensky toured the front, delivering impassioned speeches to boost the morale of the troops.
I call on the army, fortified by the strength and spirit of the revolution, to take the offensive.
After initial successes against the Germans in July of 1917, the Kerensky offensive faltered and was ultimately repelled by German and Austrian forces. The retreat eastward by Russian troops became a chaotic and catastrophic withdrawal. While the Kerensky government struggled to maintain ground in the east, the French army faced its own severe internal crisis. On April 17th, 17 soldiers from the 108th Infantry Regiment deserted their posts in the face of the enemy, marking the first of a series of acts of collective indiscipline. This unrest peaked in June and continued through the autumn. By October 23rd, approximately 250 such incidents had been recorded, with all but 12 occurring in infantry units. A staggering 68 out of 112 French divisions were affected by the wave of mutinies. The unrest took various forms, from demands for peace and the singing of revolutionary songs to stone throwing and window breaking. However, the situation grew even more serious with instances of arson, mass demonstrations, and widespread refusal to return to the front. Many soldiers expressed their willingness to hold defensive positions, but they were no longer prepared to participate in what they saw as futile assaults.
I asked what was going on, got rather evasive answers, but in the main found that the line taken by the men was that they were prepared to occupy the line, but they weren't prepared to fight.
Long-standing grievances about the harsh conditions on the front lines, resentment toward the relative comfort enjoyed by industrial workers on high wages, and a sudden wave of despair following the failure of the spring offensive seemed to play a more fundamental role in fueling unrest than political agitation or the influence of pacifist movements. After replacing Naval as commander-in-chief in mid-May, Pétain was able to restore the morale and fighting capability of the French army through a combination of reforms, understanding, and strict discipline. A total of 3,427 French soldiers were convicted by court-martial for offences related to the mutinies. Of these, 554 were sentenced to death, and 49 were actually executed. At the same time, Philippe Pétain rejected the idea of launching offensives at any cost, deciding to rule out further large-scale attacks until the United States Army had arrived in France in full strength and weapons production had been significantly ramped up. Despite his seemingly harsh exterior, Pétain had a deep understanding of his countrymen and his soldiers. "I'm waiting for the Americans and the tanks," he often declared. He quickly took steps to address the most common grievances of the frontline troops, improving medical services, welfare facilities, accommodations and food, as well as granting additional leave to help alleviate their hardships. By late August, the French army had recovered enough to launch a well-executed assault at Verdun, resulting in the recapture of the heights of the Morte, Homme and Côte 304. Another successful attack at Malmaison in October saw the French gain control of the crest of the Chemin des Dames ridge on the Aisne. However, these were relatively small-scale actions in the larger context of the ongoing conflict in France and Belgium. One of the most significant consequences of the French mutinies was that from the summer of 1917 onwards, the British and Dominion forces on the Western Front had to bear the primary responsibility for carrying out Allied offensive operations. By the summer of 1917, the war-weary Russian army was on the brink of collapse, with troops deserting in large numbers, and the Third Provisional Government close to disintegration. The crisis seemed to have no end in sight, and it appeared the Kaiser's forces could push even further into Russia. The situation was dire. The failed coup attempt by General Kornilov in late August had shaken public faith in the government, further destabilizing the already fragile Kerensky-led provisional government. Therefore, it was not surprising that on the night of the 24th to 25th of October 1917, the last hope for moderate democracy in Russia was extinguished by a Bolshevik-led coup. The Bolshevik Party, led by the passionate revolutionary Vladimir Lenin, had gained widespread support among workers, peasants and soldiers due to their opposition to the war and their promise of an end to Russia's imperialist involvement. Lenin had established himself as a powerful orator and writer, calling for immediate revolution. The Bolshevik slogan, "Land, Peace and Bread," resonated deeply with the masses during the turbulent months of May through August 1917. After securing power in Petrograd, Lenin moved swiftly, pressing the Germans for an armistice with the Central Powers on the 26th of October. On 22nd December 1917, representatives of the newly formed Russian government gathered in the Polish town of Brest-Litovsk, located on the River Bug, to seek peace with the Central Powers. The Bolshevik government aimed to negotiate a peace without annexation or indemnity. However, the German delegation, led by Max Hoffmann, the German commander of the Eastern Front, insisted on territorial demands in the east. These demands prompted the leader of the Russian delegation, Leon Trotsky, to withdraw the Bolshevik ministers from the talks. Critics of Trotsky's decision argued that he was leaving the fledgling Bolshevik state vulnerable to further German invasions. However, Trotsky defended his actions, claiming that his move was meant to inspire the workers of the world to unite and overthrow the governments of the warring nations. For a week, the situation between Bolshevik Russia and the Central Powers remained in a state of no war, no peace. However, on the 18th of February 1918, the Central Powers' war machine began to advance once more in the east. The consequences of abandoning the peace talks were soon apparent. By the end of February 1918, the Germans and their allies were advancing through Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, showing no signs of slowing down. At one point, the German fleet emerged from beneath the ice of the Baltic Sea, preparing to invade the Gulf of Finland and lay siege to St. Petersburg, the Russian capital, which had reclaimed its pre-war name. Realizing the urgency, the Russians quickly recognized the necessity of a peace treaty and hastily appealed for a second ceasefire with the Central Powers. On the 3rd of March, 1918, the panic-stricken Russians agreed to terms with the Central Powers and signed a treaty whose terms were far more draconian than ones they'd turned down a few weeks prior. In the agreement, the Bolsheviks surrendered 750,000 square kilometers of territory, an area 3 times the size of Germany, containing a quarter of Russia's population and industrial resources, and a third of its agricultural land. When the armistice of November 1918 was signed and the peace talks in Paris began in 1919, the reparations and territorial concessions made in 1918 were disregarded by the Soviet government. The key outcomes of the Brest-Litovsk Treaty were twofold. First, the end of the Eastern Front, which allowed the German and Central Powers to redeploy their forces to the Western Front. And second, the emergence of independent nations like Poland, Finland, and the Baltic states, no longer under the rule of the Russian Tsar. While the Western Front continued to burn with intense fighting, the East remained temporarily quiet. That is, until the outbreak of civil war, which would devastate the former Russian Empire, resulting in millions of deaths from both battle and starvation.
It's a long way to Tipperary, to the sweetest girl I know. Goodbye, Piccadilly, farewell, Leicester Square. It's a long, long way to Tipperary, but my heart's right there. It's a long way to Tipperary. It's a long